do something for me. I'd like you to try to just think about the last time that you were in a public restroom. Let's think maybe off campus. So maybe you were at a restaurant, maybe you were at the movie theater, maybe you were at the, I don't know, if there's a mall out here. Go down to Eureka. So you use the restroom, and maybe, you know, there are hassles in a restaurant. You might have had to wait in line. Maybe there was no soap in the dispenser. Maybe somebody was taking too long. But I'd like you to try to imagine if you were in a restroom and suddenly somebody else from the restroom came over to you and said rather starkly, "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong bathroom." Or try to imagine what it might be like to have actually a security guard come into the bathroom and say, "I need you to come with me." This reflects the lived experience of many transgender people across the country, and it represents some of the legislation that I know many of you have heard of that is beginning to restrict the use of restrooms for transgender people. So first, I'd like to thank you all for having me and for me to have me share this work. My style in classes is very interactive, so please ask questions, particularly if you're in research methods. I kind of frame the talk as almost a teaching talk. So for those of you who are taking research methods, I'm hoping that you can follow along. If something confuses you, raise your hand. So here we are. You've all probably heard, this is in the public eye right now. What we have is basically a push across the nation in different ways to restrict the use of restrooms for transgender people to the restroom associated with their birth sex. Okay? So if a transgender woman, she identifies as a woman, she presents as a woman, she, either through forced legislation or public pressure, might be forced to use the men's room. The Trump administration has recently removed previous guidance from Title IX that President Obama had put in around how to interpret laws for transgender people. Gavin Grimm is a transgender male who faced discrimination in restrooms in school and is bringing his case to the Supreme Court. The most common that many of you have heard of is the law in North Carolina, HB 2, which specifically states that people who use public restrooms must use restrooms that correspond to their birth sex. This isn't the only law. Currently, according to the National Transgender Equality Organization, I just looked up, what states have legislation that's either in committee or pending around restricted use around the restroom, and these include Alabama, Illinois, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Missouri, New York, South Carolina, South Dakota failed in committee, so they're going to bring it back. Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia failed in committee. So we have states all over the nation that are either preparing legislation or proposing legislation aimed to restrict restroom use to one's birth sex. What I am going to do today is share with you that despite all of this push for legal action, there's very little known about people's views about trans people, well, certainly in the restroom, but in terms of transgender attitudes anyway. The literature, particularly in social psychology, is very young. Okay? So what I'm going to do is share some of that literature with you. I'm going to review research on transgender prejudice, tell you what we know at this stage. Also review, there's a lot, we do have quite a bit of knowledge on transgender discrimination. We have some of the surveys are incredible, 30,000 participants of transgender people in reporting their discrimination. So I'll share with you that. I'll share with you factors that are known to correlate with trans prejudice, and then I'll return to this restroom issue and present the research that I'm going to be talking about today. Let's just be clear on what we mean by transgender, yeah? Transgender can be conceptualized as an umbrella term. Okay? Transgender says here, any person who crosses over or challenges I would say the gender one was assigned at birth, okay? And wants to live a different gender. Now that experience can take a lot of different forms. All of these are examples of transgender identities. Male to female, meaning that a person was born biologically male and either through just presentation as a female, sometimes it's surgery, sometimes it's hormones, lives their life as a female. Female to male is the opposite. Bigender, third gender. So research shows that transgender people widely vary in how they identify. Okay? But transgender literally means cross-gender. Transvestite is more of a pejorative term. Cross-dressers are included under this umbrella. Genderqueer are people who blur gender binaries and say that the male-female thing is basically an illusion. Yeah? Transsexual. Does everybody understand the difference between transsexual and transgender? Who knows? Yeah, what is it?
One refers to your physical genitalia and one refers to what you choose to identify as?
Yes, very good. So a transsexual is typically defined as a person who has had some kind of surgical procedure to adapt the genitalia toward the chosen identity. And a lot of times people use transsexual and transgender synonymously. Not a good idea, because many transgender people don't do that, okay, and don't pursue surgery, and it also reflects a medicalized term rather than a psychological identity. Okay, but that's a big umbrella. Okay? And we're just beginning to understand people's views about people who identify that way. Where we are now is, it only has been in the past decade that this has been directly measured through scales. So we have Hill and Willoughby's scale was developed in 2005. And that's actually a large, kind of unwieldy scale that measures a lot of different things, such as violence towards trans people, attitudes toward cross-dressing, views about gender roles. Julie Nagoshi later focused her scale on attitudes toward people who just blur gender boundaries, okay? Who kind of live not male, not female. Tibe and Murati have shortened Hill and Willoughby's scale. The samples we have range from Canada, Hong Kong, Spain, Britain, US. One thing that I can say is that transgender prejudice is widespread. Transgender prejudice is acute. A national probability sample, which those of you who are in research methods, you should go, ooh. Why? Why do we love national probability samples? Any methods folks here? Anybody have an idea? What do they tell you more than, say, if I were to sample all of you about people's views? Anyone have an idea? I heard somebody kind of mumble it. Yes. What they tell you is they really give more of an approximate view of the population of the US. So a national probability sample from Greg Herrick at UC Davis and his graduate student at the time measured prejudice across a range of different groups, including gay men, lesbian women, bisexuals, men and women, okay, straight men and women, and found that across all of them, the highest in prejudice was transgender people. Okay? And they were above and beyond the prejudice level for both gay men, lesbian women, and bisexuals. So we know that trans prejudice is pretty widespread. Things that we know at this stage are factors that are associated with it, kind of parallel the sexual prejudice literature. Okay? So people who are higher in anti-gay prejudice tend to be higher in trans prejudice. Hostile and benevolent sexism, basically this kind of two-sided of sexism, either cherishing a woman cherishing a woman in terms of positive attitudes that also end up being rather restricting. hostile sexism, more negative attitudes toward women. Both of those correlate with trans prejudice. Strict fundamentalist religiosity, right-wing authoritarianism, masculinity, rape myth acceptance. Anybody know what that is? What's that? What's rape myth acceptance? Shy group. Yeah? Rape myth acceptance are beliefs such as, what women wear actually is what caused them to be raped. If women drink, then she can just expect to be, then it makes the rape kind of explained. Okay? Note the word myth. Yeah. Okay? But people who are high in this belief also are high in trans prejudice. The three that I want to kind of pop today, because they are the focus of my investigation, are the following. There are gender differences, at least in the Herrick scale, such that men are higher in trans prejudice than women. Now, Herrick and Norton did not measure trans women and trans men separately, so we don't know if they differ about trans men and trans women, but we know that men were higher in trans prejudice overall. From the anti-gay prejudice literature, a pretty stable finding since the 90s has been that men are higher in prejudice overall than women. Men are particularly prejudiced toward gay men, more prejudiced toward gay men than lesbians. And then for women, typically their prejudice toward gay men and lesbians are around the same. Okay? So we know at least for trans that there's a gender difference, that men are more prejudiced toward transgender people as a group. A binary view of gender, so Norton and Herrick just asked a question such as, how much do you believe that being male and female are qualitatively different? Okay? And that you can be only male or female, never both. That's a binary view. The more people agreed with that, the higher they were in trans prejudice. And then Julie Negoshi's work measured trait aggression. So think of the most aggressive person that you know. This is their scale. Okay? This is like an individual difference in aggression. So people who, by their individual difference, tend to be hot-tempered, tend to lash out. Okay? People who were high in trait aggression were also high in transgender prejudice. Yeah? Okay. Transgender discrimination, we actually have a lot of data. Unbelievable. The National Center for Transgender Equality, along with some of my mentors back at Penn State, Sue Rankin, actually have every year since 2011 distributed a nationwide survey on the experiences of transgender people. There was a book written on it, The Lives of Transgender People. That'll be up on one of the slides if you want to read that. That was from 2012. But the data from 2015 just came in. And here's what they are finding. So we have 27,000 participants. Okay? That is remarkable. 27,000 participants from every state in the nation, okay? Who were a range of transgender identities. And it is similar to the past reports. This is the 2012 report. It was called Injustice at Every Turn. Okay? And what is known is pervasive mistreatment and violence. In just the year before they completed the survey, half the sample experienced verbal harassment, 9% were physically assaulted for being trans, 10% sexually assaulted for being trans. The majority of respondents who were out at school, so we have a lot of youth tend to be particularly vulnerable. 54% of youth were harassed at school. 24% of youth, this is K through 12, were physically attacked for their trans identity at school. 13% were sexually assaulted, again, for being trans. 17% left school as a result of this mistreatment. 30% had lost a job in the past year. And nearly 1/3, 29%, were living in poverty. A staggering 40% of the sample had attempted suicide, a serious attempt, at some point in the past 5 years. Then they measured mistreatment in restrooms. 59%, 60% of the sample avoided public restrooms at least once in the past year. 32%, try to imagine this, actually limit or regulate the food and drink they have so they don't have to go to the bathroom in public. 8% reported a urinary tract infection or kidney infection that was linked from avoiding restrooms. So they are reporting widespread discrimination. So let's return to the restrooms. Take a look at this slide with me, because it kind of represents the double bind that many transgender people faced. I noticed that many of the restrooms here were labeled man-woman. Do you have gender-neutral restrooms?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. Okay. When you have just two choices, like at the movies or a restaurant, what I was kind of asking you to imagine today, transgender people face risks either way. If they go into the restroom aligned with their birth sex, so imagine a person presenting as a woman, identifying as a woman, going into the men's room because this person was born male. That person risks anger, surprise, and hostility from the other men in the restroom. Same thing with transgender men. Okay? Imagine in the women's room somebody who appears to be male. Okay? They risk anger, surprise, even hostility from other women in the restroom. Well, let's switch it. Let's say they want to go to the restroom that they identify with. Okay, so transgender women, people born male but identify as women, go into the women's room. Well, then it depends. What might it depend on? Yes, how well she passes, which is, are people, do people categorize her as male, okay, versus the transgender identity is assumed as female, okay? So they risk being, it's called clocked and categorized as their birth gender, and they too face risks. A female to male college student in a qualitative study described bathrooms in this way. They are sites of terror. I have had security guards remove me because they had quote unquote complaints from other students. And we know from, in addition to the National Transgender Survey, other research shows that restroom harassment is common, particularly for youth. DC, a report from DC, 18% of the sample was denied access to their chosen restroom, either at work or in public. 68%, again, verbal harassment, 9%. Almost the percentages across studies are becoming remarkably common. Does that make sense? Okay. And the reactions that trans people report include seeing people hiding outside the restroom until they leave. Okay. Then as they leave the restroom, somebody then goes into the restroom. Another one is somebody simply coming up and approaching them and saying, I think you were in the wrong bathroom. Versus many are then met with a security guard who has escorted them out. Okay. Given this, we know trans people are reporting this, yeah? What we don't know is there have been zero, at least in social psychology, studies that actually measures the public's views about transgender people in public restrooms. And that's what this work is intended to fill. So, and also just look at here. You can see how it's kind of reflected in rhetoric. This side, no men in women's showers. And then here, these are ads that were in favor of some of this legislation. And then it here says, any man, anytime. What is that really getting at? What does that ad mean? So, no men in women's showers, any man, anytime. What is the assumption behind that ad? Yeah.
That if you allow transgender people to use the restrooms which they choose to use, that all men are allowed to use the women's bathroom.
Yes, that by, that the assumption or the logic is, well, if this is allowed, then any man can then go and harass women. Okay. The states that actually have trans-positive restroom laws, there's zero evidence of that happening. Okay. But also what you see is the erasure of trans people themselves. Do you see that through this ad? They're not men. They're not men. They're identifying as women. And then on the other side, for trans men, one side, women's room, get yelled at. What are you doing in the ladies' room? Get out. You look like a boy. Get beat up. Okay? So there's the double bind. So what did I do? Myself and my undergraduate research assistant, Kyle Zukowski, what we turned to was we wanted to assess the views of trans people in public restrooms. We wanted to manipulate, so we're going to do an experiment, and people are going to get one or two versions. They're either going to respond about a transgender woman or a transgender man, and that's through random assignment. And then we're going to identify potential correlates. One, I've already told you about, trait aggression. We know that it's associated with trans prejudice. Let's see if it's associated with restroom reactions. Essentialism, we wanted to take this binary view of gender and approach it more theoretically. So essentialism is a theoretical construct about social groups in general. And essentialism is basically the belief, at least with gender, that categories are distinct, they're discrete, okay? They almost, and they're biologically derived, so you're either a man or a woman, you cannot be both. Race can be essentialized, black or white, no room for anything else, okay? So this belief in social categories as almost having like a spiritual, that this belief that, gender comes from sex, which is assigned through, God or deity. We wanted to measure that. So, let's look at the hypotheses. We had 4. First, given that transgender prejudice is so acute, we believed that if people were to be asked, well, which restroom does this person belong to? We hypothesized that people would be relegating transgender people to the birth sex restroom rather than the identity restroom. Using the sexual prejudice literature as a guide and Norton and Herrick's prior work as a guide, we hypothesized that men would be more negative overall than women. And transgender women from the discrimination literature report significantly more severe discrimination and verbal attacks than transgender men. Okay? It doesn't mean that the attacks for transgender men don't happen, but there's a big difference between them. So we hypothesized that this would follow, that the reactions toward trans women would be more negative than reactions to trans men. And then lastly, we thought that these two qualities would correlate. Essentialism and trait aggression should predict negative reactions. Okay? Any questions on the hypotheses? They clear? Okay. So, what did we do? We set up an online experiment using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where people across the country sign up for a study for a small amount of payment. This was only in the US. We had 158 people, 81% white, so you see that it's predominantly a white sample. The age was higher than undergraduate samples. The median age was 35. Okay, so these were an older sample than undergraduate samples. Then for our measures, we used the essentialist belief scale, and I'm going to show you some items in a moment from Bastian and Haslam, the trait aggression measure from Buss and Perry, and then we also measured social desirability. Anybody know what that is? Yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
I've already spoken. If someone else has
Somebody else? What's social desirability? Is it good or bad? Yeah.
Presenting themselves in a way to seem better.
Yeah, kind of obscuring the truth. If what we're after are people's unfiltered attitudes, people who are high in social desirability kind of want to look good and are kind of managing how they look. So we have a scale that can actually measure the extent to which people do that and see if it correlates with any of our measures. In this instance, it did not. Okay? So social desirability wasn't correlated with any of the reactions measures, and when it was included as a covariate, the results didn't change at all. Okay? So that's it's the only time I'm going to mention social desirability, because in this instance, it wasn't correlated. Okay? So, just so you know what these measures are, I just put up a couple of samples. Okay? So essentialism, a couple of sample items are whether someone is one kind of person or another is determined by their biological makeup. This, biological sex and gender are the same thing. The kind of person someone is clearly defined. They either are a certain kind of person or they're not. For aggression, so this is actually, if you look at this questionnaire, these are rather aggressive people if you agree with these. Once in a while, I can't control the urge to strike another person. I have threatened people that I know. So this was on a 1 to 7 scale. The mean was a 3, so they were below the midpoint at least. Importantly, no gender differences in the scale. We checked. Typically, men may report higher aggression than women. That didn't happen here. Okay. Essentialism, 0 to 10. People are kind of in the middle of the road with essentialism. Essentialism and aggression were not correlated. Okay. So, but there's your needs. Okay. Then what we did, we wanted to have a cover story to reduce demand characteristics. We didn't want it to be clear what we were doing. So we told them that the study was about opinions about social situations. And they'd be reviewing different social situations. So the first one was used as a filler. It was about coffee. It was actually, quite frankly, based on my own experience. And it basically said, this person is waiting in a line for coffee and is noticing that everybody in front of him is ordering nothing except white chocolate mochas, hot chocolates, and whipped cream drinks. The person wanted to have a separate line just for people who wanted coffee. How much do you agree or disagree? Okay? I hope you all agree. So they read that one. Okay? And again, that's really to preserve the cover story and reduce demand characteristics. Then what we did was we had them, they read a situation of somebody going to the restroom, and we randomly assigned within gender. Okay? So what that means is that we're interested in men's thoughts about trans people in the men's room. Does that make sense? Like at this point, it would have been too much to randomly assign, well, imagine that a woman is sharing with a trans woman in the woman's room. So we randomly assigned within gender. Okay? So male participants were randomly assigned one of 2 situations, and this was one of them. Okay? So the trans woman condition, Jim went to the movies with his friends. During the movie, he had to use the restroom. Upon entering the restroom, he saw a woman washing her hands. There was something about her appearance that caused him to look more closely. After a few seconds, it was clear why. The woman washing her hands was actually a biological man dressed and presenting as a woman. Jim was surprised first and then uncomfortable. The trans man condition is the exact same thing, except it was worded such that he saw a man washing his hands. Okay? Then, a few seconds later, it was clear that this was a biological woman. Now, the females received the same thing, except it was about the women's room. So we have Kim at the movies. Okay? So they're identical, except for who they're sharing the restroom with. Okay? And that's an example of the trans man condition. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay? We wanted to avoid the word transgender, specifically. We didn't want to say, Jim went to the movies and saw a transgender person washing his hands. Why might that be something to consider? Why Yeah.
Because then, like, there's those opinions.
Yeah, we could prime political correctness, and also it really doesn't reflect how these situations unfold. Okay? I don't know of situations in the restroom where somebody walks in and somebody goes, "Excuse me, just so you know, I'm trans. Here's my card." Typically, this unfolds through a series of perceptions. Okay, so we wanted to capture that. So then we asked them to imagine if you were in the situation. And we asked them, on a scale of 1 to 7, Kim or Jim, depending on what gender they were, should use, so Kim and Jim, the person, not Kim or Jim, should use either the men's room, the women's room, or neither. Okay? To what extent would you, and these came straight from the transgender discrimination literature, of the actual experiences and reactions that transgender people report, to what extent would you feel discomfort? To what extent would you stop and wait for the person to leave? To what extent would you notify the guard? To what extent would you approach and ask the person to leave? Okay? So this first one isn't as clear. I'm asking them, which restroom does this person at the sink belong in? Okay? So, what did we find? First, hypothesis 1, we found evidence that people overwhelmingly agreed that trans people should be in birth sex bathrooms. So this was just a main effect for target. Okay? It didn't matter whether they were men or women. All people argued that trans women should use the men's room. Trans men should use the women's room. That's what that chart is showing. Okay. We also, there was no interaction about, there was no effect for men versus women or target. But we also asked, to what extent do you think they belong in neither restroom? And we just ran a frequency for who agreed to strongly disagreed with this. And we found that for trans men, 18% either agreed to strongly agreed that they shouldn't be in either restroom. And trans women, 27% believe that they should not be in either restroom, the men's room or the women's room. Okay? So first, we have evidence for birth sex bathrooms. Now let's go to the reactions. I want to remind you of the predictions and then what we found. For those of you who are taking research methods, what we were predicting were 2 main effects. We were predicting a main effect for gender, in that men would be more negative overall. And we were predicting a main effect for target, in that trans women would receive more negativity overall. Not what we found. What we found was an interaction effect, meaning that there's something about the combination of men being in a restroom with either a trans woman or a trans man that changes the reactions and vice versa. So I'm going to go through these now. For discomfort. First of all, let's anchor ourselves to the scale. It went from 1 to 7, so most people are feeling rather uncomfortable. Okay? People are scoring above the midpoint of the scale. Okay? But we see in the trans woman condition, who is more uncomfortable? Use your quantitative skills here. Who is more uncomfortable? Women or men? Women are more uncomfortable. Okay? In the trans men condition, men and women didn't differ. Okay. Next, let's look at, and we're going from the more indirect behaviors to the more direct confrontational behaviors. Okay? Stop and wait for the person to leave. Okay? What we see here is that women are more likely than men in the trans women condition to stop, wait outside the restroom, and wait for the person to leave. Okay? But in the trans man condition, no gender differences. Okay? But notice, women were less likely to wait for a trans man to leave. Notify a security guard. Here, we find that women were more likely to notify men in the trans woman condition, but men were more likely to notify the guard in the trans man condition. Yeah.
I want to clarify something about the design. I thought that men were assigned to the trans men.
No, they're assigned to either trans women or trans men, but
Gotcha.
they're only thinking about their own bathroom.
Gotcha.
Okay, they're only thinking about the men's room. It would just get too meta to ask. Imagine you were, in the women's room. Do you think that trans men should leave the women's room with their guy? Okay,
Right,
so
right.
we randomly assign. I guess a better way to put it is within restroom. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then approach asked to leave. Now note, these effects are smaller, and they're on the bottom end of the scale. This happens for things like online experiments, so I don't want to kind of overstate these findings. They're still, on the low end of the scale. Okay. But what we see is that men were more than likely than women to approach and ask a trans man to leave. So that's basically, again, trans man is in the restroom. You should leave, you're in the wrong bathroom. Okay. No differences in the trans woman condition. All right. Now what you're going to see is how these two variables affected or predicted these reactions. And we approached these analyses in an exploratory way. We really just, all that is known is that they are predictive. We entered them into a regression, a simultaneous regression, with gender target and their interactions. But because no prior work has done this, we approached these analyses from an exploratory place. Okay? And what we found, and we're going to go through each of them, is that we found pretty, especially when it came to the more confrontational reactions, a consistent three-way interaction between gender, aggression, and target. Okay? So I'm going to go through those now, because what you'll see is things begin to reverse depending on aggressive people. For discomfort, we found this three-way interaction. And this is just a little odd. We found that men, but not women, felt less discomfort if they were aggressive around a trans man. Another way to put that is aggressive men weren't bothered by trans men in the restroom. Okay? They were less likely, maybe they're manly men, and they don't feel uncomfortable. Okay? Hard to understand what that one is, but that's what was found. Okay? There were no relationships for women at all, and there was no relationship between aggression and the trans women condition for men. Essentialism, the only thing that it predicted, in this case, was whether people would stop and leave. And this was the case for everybody. This was regardless of gender and regardless of target. So essentialism predicted stopping and waiting to leave for both men and women across conditions. I also want to mention to you folks that we did run regressions on this variable and the restrooms they assigned, okay, to see if people high in essentialism would be more likely to send people to girl-sex bathrooms. The correlations weren't significant and the regressions weren't significant. So now let's move to the more direct behaviors. Notify a guard. Again, we found a three-way interaction, and we interpreted this through simple slopes. Aggression predicted, so we have to kind of switch our thinking. So think of aggressive men. It is predicting notifying the guard if there's a trans woman in the bathroom. Okay. So when there's a trans woman in the men's room, men who are aggressive are more likely to notify a guard. Okay. When there's a trans woman in the men's room, okay, men who are aggressive are more likely to notify the guard. But if it's a trans man, no relationship at all. Let's look at what women did. here, oops, it approached significance for women notifying a car for trans men, but it's .06, so it really doesn't count. I don't even like saying the word approached. But not trans women, okay? So maybe in another study this would be significant, but I would say that there's very little evidence, at least for women, that aggression is predicting them notifying a guard. Okay. I'm almost done. Approach and ask the person to leave. This is pretty interesting. For men, see the same thing. When there's a trans woman in the men's room, aggressive men are more likely to approach them and say, you're in the wrong restroom, get out. Okay. If it's a trans man, no. Okay. But for women, it's the reverse. For women, when women are sharing a restroom with trans men, aggressive women are more likely to go to a trans man and say, leave. Not the trans women. So that's what we found. What does this tell us? You know, I know there's a pun with the name of the talk being Nowhere to Go, but I did not intend it to be that. I really mean, from these data at least, it's showing that their options are limited. Okay? That there is, in many instances, nowhere to go. Because first, the general consensus is that people believe that trans people should go to the birth sex bathrooms or no bathroom at all. If they are in the restroom that they identify with, trans women risk reactions from women, trans men risk reactions from men. If they go to the birth sex bathroom, either by policy, being forced to, or choice, they have to worry about aggressive people. They have to worry about aggressive people. In this case, trans women risk reactions from aggressive men. Trans men risk reactions from aggressive women. We just ran a replication of this with double the sample. The sample size was small, especially for three-way interactions. So we're currently analyzing data with over 300 people. This is self-report. It would be kind of hard to do a high-impact study in a restroom. Okay. In this study, you're going to have to go to the bathroom. You know, so that's different. So self-report may differ from actual behavior, but this actually might be an underestimate of what happens. Okay. And again, the word trans wasn't specified. Okay. So they may have in their mind something other than transgender, but I would like to emphasize that even if it is a cross-dresser, those are transgender people. Okay? It's possible that the word biological male or female might have primed essentialism thought, but if that were the case, I would have expected stronger relationships with essentialism and the other variables. What we're doing now as we speak is there's something going on with trans women, and we think that women are afraid. Okay? So we are now testing affect to see what are people feeling in these situations. For women, we think the reaction is fear. For men, we think it may be either anger or contempt toward trans women. And then my colleague Lisa Platt and I next are looking at using visual information. Okay? This issue of passive. Okay? Are people who are less congruent with their chosen gender identity more at risk? I just want to end with what we're seeing is, you know, through the reports of discrimination, through these views that people should use neither restroom, the policing behaviors I've measured here, what we're seeing in many ways of the erasure of trans identities. This is a bus in Spain, and this is directly translated, boys have penises, girls have vulvas, do not be fooled. And I'm hoping that I'm beginning to convince you today that trans identities exist and that they share public space. And Laverne Cox recently said at the end of the day, we have to remember that bathroom access is not about bathrooms. Our opponents know that. They're trying to make sure that these bathroom laws are about whether trans people have the right to exist in public space. So I want to thank you so much for your attention. These are some of my